I was also almost like uh, caught by not caught by surprise is not the exact way to say it, but a little bit of caught by surprise by Chester's voice and just kind of taking me back to that early place of like oh yeah, like I love his voice. Like this, he's got an awesome, incredible connection with what he's singing, and there's so much power there. And it was just almost like I was hearing him sing something fresh and new.
I want to begin with those kind of early inspirations with this record. Obviously, you'd had Hybrid Theory. It did what it did. It set the world on fire a little bit, and it kind of brought out a new lane to that sound that was around at the time, not just in rock but in nu metal specifically, and it really kind of established itself as a something a little bit different. Where do you begin when you're starting to think about how do we follow that up? Is that in your brain? Is there a pressure there, or is it just okay? Let's see what happens on the next one.
I think for me, Hybrid Theory had obviously so much success. It was such a big album. It kind of like, I think it caught everyone by surprise, including ourselves, what that did. But thankfully, at the process where we are coming to the end of the touring cycle with Hybrid Theory and beginning to work on the next record, the success that Hybrid Theory had hadn't really caught up with our everyday life. So for us, everything still kind of felt in a way pretty similar to how it had, a year and a half, 2 years prior, which is when we would have been sitting before Hybrid Theory even came out. Um, so when it came, it almost was like, for me, it was this idea of we went into Hybrid Theory with this mindset of let's write and make music that we really want to hear, that we're excited about, that we love. And then when it kind of worked, it almost reinforced that of like, oh yeah, why wouldn't we just do that again? Like that, that we were also young and maybe in a sense like didn't have the wisdom to kind of be able to really sit back and say, this is a crazy, turbulent time we're going through. And like, if the second record doesn't work, that might be the end of our career. Like they're just certain things that thankfully weren't even coming into the mix. It was just like, yeah, it worked for us to get together and write and just try to write stuff we loved. And it worked that people also then gravitated towards it and liked it. So yeah, let's do that again. And then after, as it came closer to like the release date for Meteora, and we were doing a ton of press and interviews with it, then people, are asking us constantly, how do you deal with the pressure, blah, 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 blah. And at that point, my brain kind of clicked in and kind of said, oh yeah, there is a lot of pressure here. Like, that's why this question is getting asked every single time. And like, I didn't think about that, or I wasn't even like realizing that. But I think for the creative space, thankfully, that wasn't there for me during the writing.
It feels like there's definitely a sense of confidence on this record, which was definitely present there with Hybrid Theory as well. It definitely felt like it came out all guns blazing in a way. But with this, I mean, we'll come on to some of the kind of sound experiments you have on there, but there must have been a certain level of confidence when you go into the studio to not just push yourselves creatively, but I don't know, I guess trust yourselves a little bit. It's worked once. Why wouldn't it work again in a way? You've got, I suppose, a little bit of extra backing to yourself when you're going into a situation like that, right?
Yeah, and I think to put myself back in the headspace that we were in back then, we really felt like it was us against the world in a lot of respects. Um, and then as it moved forward, it was kind of like always us and like our fan base against the world. Like we were right at that beginning moment of the internet really starting to go huge and people starting to be able to have dialogue in chat rooms. So when Hybrid Theory came out and was doing really well, we were excited about that, but we're also seeing all this stuff in chat rooms that we didn't know how to deal with, criticism and people just being, just kind of like the beginnings of that nastiness that can come out of it, out of the internet, or out of just like opening yourselves up to saying, all right, world, like anyone can say whatever they want, and I guess I'll read it. I guess I'll see it and be exposed to that. So we kind of had this us against the world mentality, even when it came to our own record company. We had some challenges on Hybrid Theory, And at a certain point, we had kind of made the decision we want to do it our way or we don't want to do it at all. Like we don't, it doesn't feel like it's going to be worth it or doesn't feel like it's going to be something that feels right at like a gut or heart level if we can't do it how we want to do it. And thankfully, we won that fight. And when it came time to do Meteora, our experience had just been shut everybody else out and just do our own thing. That's like, that's our headspace of how we want to operate and what we want to do. And then we'd kind of like the whole process been developing a really cool kind of connection with fans that was new at that time period too, of just being able to kind of have an open dialogue using the internet and get feedback from that space. So we knew we wanted to connect with people. We knew first and foremost we wanted to connect with the own music that we were writing and recording. But then we knew that we wanted to be able to hand that over and hopefully have other people experience it, in a similar way emotionally that we were. And we knew because of the internet at that point that people were connecting with what we had done in the past. So I think in whether it was consciously or subconsciously, the real effort in that, the real confidence in that came out of that space of the goal is to connect. The goal is for us first and foremost to connect with the music. What are we working on? What are we writing that's making the hair stand up on our arms? What's getting us going? And then let's get that to a place where we can share it and hopefully have other people kind of share that experience as well.
It's a good attitude to have, and I imagine it must have been one when you were sort of collating the early ideas. It's got to be what spurred you forward. Finding what out of those early kind of demos and things like that that are actually going to get you the most excited. And I understand that kind of was starting while you guys were still touring, right? Those kind of initial kind of thoughts and maybe initial riffs and ideas were starting to develop from there. Do you remember some of those early demos and like you guys playing each other kind of different ideas that you had while you were still feasibly out on the road promoting this other record at the time?
One was so we had this studio set up in the back of the tour bus, and it was back then to have a recording rig that was mobile was quite a process. It was like the equivalent of having an entire room filled with a computer. It took up so much space, and it was in this big, heavy rack. And at the end of it, it like compared to what we can do now, obviously the capabilities were very limited. But we were so excited to have a mobile writing system that we could at least kind of recreate a version of Mike's bedroom home studio, that he had in his apartment. So now we had a way that we could put that in the bus, bring it on tour with us, start to get ideas down. And in that, like, kind of really rudimentary version of a writing studio, two of the things that came out of that were really cool was the uh, entire kind of beginning of Somewhere I Belong. So the first sound you hear in that was like a guitar riff that Chester had been messing around with on an acoustic chord progression. Mike was able to kind of like manipulate that, reverse it, chop it up to be able to keep the same chord progression and kind of create some new sounds. And then also like I think I don't think any of it stayed in as far as the actual recording, but some of the writing from the inside was done. I just had a kind of a weird riff that I'd been playing around with that was in 6/8 time, and we were able to get that done in the back lounge, kind of get that idea out. And that those moments of writing were really early on for the Meteora process, but it stayed through the entire next however many months. And both of those songs obviously ended up being on the album and kind of being cool little participants in that whole bit.
Yeah, I'm curious when we talk a little bit about how that dynamic was when you guys were playing each other ideas and how that kind of developed. It's interesting to me to see how I guess you guys as a band functioning will have developed to that time, because when you're making your first record, it's rookie stuff. You don't necessarily know what roles you're all going to take when you get in the studio, because it's a very new experience for everyone involved. Now that you'd
Mm-hmm.
had a bit of experience in that way and obviously spent all this time on the road together, and you're all very good friends obviously, when it came time to go back into the studio again, had that dynamic changed? Had you all fallen into kind of natural roles in a way?
I think I think the second so Meteora as the second album for us, I think was a lot more. of an enjoyable process. One of the major parts of that just being the fact that hybrid theory had been successful. So now it was suddenly like, little things that sound funny. Like we had a budget to order lunch at the studio when we were working. Like we didn't have to pack peanut butter and jelly into the studio and just try to like figure out how we're gonna, how are we gonna record our album that we want to record on this budget, let alone like actually eat while we're doing it, or different funny things. It was just so stressful. Everything with hybrid theory was new. It's almost like equivalent. I can make the equivalency of like being a first time dad. When my first daughter, when I bring her home from the hospital, it was so stressful for me to even put her in a car seat because I'd never done that before. And everything is just like, oh, you don't want to mess it up. Like this is a brand new experience and everything's brand new. By the time you get to the second kid or the second album, you're kind of like palming the baby and doing it one handed while you're also doing this over here. It's the same thing a little bit with the studio. You're kind of like, oh, I don't need to find out or figure out how this, and this works. Like I've done that. Like now we can just kind of just be here for the process of what we're doing and really focus on that. So I think the process in that regard with Meteora was a lot more enjoyable for everybody. I think the timing was more impacted. There's the cliches. You have your whole life to write your first album, and you have a 2-month window to write your second. We tried to get a jump on that, as we talked about, starting our writing process while we were still touring. But at the same time, you still feel a little bit of that crunch to make sure you're getting out, not only all of your ideas, but hopefully getting out some good ones in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess when it came time for that studio setup, having someone like Don Gilmore on board as well is going to be, it's going to be a blessing. It's going to help you find that ease and that dynamic again, and obviously a sense of familiarity there as well. And I imagine he is a bass player as well. So I imagine your connection there would have been, that's a nice extra pair of hands to have. There's where I guess it's almost going to be a second language in a way for a lot of the stuff when you were recording personally.
Yeah, when you have a bass player as your producer, at the very least, you know that he thinks the bass is at least slightly important. Whereas if your producer is not a bass player, you might have somebody who doesn't think it's important at all. No, Don was great, and I think for Don too, his process on Hybrid Theory, the first album, was difficult and challenging in the relationship with the record company, and we just had some battles back and forth in different ways. And coming into the second one, he told us, he owned it and just said, "Hey, look, I made some mistakes in how that communication was coming into the studio and everything else." And he's like, "This one, we're not doing any of that. Like it's just us, and we're gonna create our own little happy space here in the studio." And he did. Like, to his credit, it was awesome, and we had a really enjoyable experience with Don. Um, he was great. And one of the things too, in kind of looking back at this project, one of the things that I thought was really cool when we found the track Lost was just that you can hear how that fits so well in that Meteora world. And it was because that was a song that went through the entire process with Don. Went into NRG, which is the studio we recorded it in. We recorded it there at the same time. Like, Don was advising and producing as we went through that entire process. Whereas a lot of the other demos, you can hear that I mean, if you're really getting into it with like sophisticated ear, you could hear, okay, these were maybe written around the same time or the same time period, but they didn't go through all of the different hoops that the album did. Well, Lost was an interesting track for us to come back to because it did go through all those hoops. It got mixed by Andy Wallace, everything. So it sounds like it could just fit right after Numb on the album itself. Um, yeah, but in the process, it didn't make the album, and then, no pun intended, we forgot about it or lost it. And 20 years later, that was probably the reason for me, the biggest reason why I was excited to do this package, was kind of refinding that track and just saying, okay, this is really cool. I think people might be excited to hear this.
It's nice as well because it does fit in really well, like you say, with the overall sound of the record. But that sound this record has certain moments where you can really feel you guys stretching yourselves creatively. There's loads of tracks I want to talk about, but let's touch briefly on that lost comparison with Numb, which I think a lot of people have been. It feels like they're almost sister anthems in a little bit of a way.
Hmm.
And one interesting thing I was thinking back on when I did one of these conversations with Joe around the Hybrid Theory reissue, we were talking to him then about She Couldn't. And he said something that kind of stuck with me, which was that She Couldn't kind of set the stage for Numb later on. It set the stage for trying your hand at that sort of more emotive, softer edge to the Linkin Park sound that we already knew and loved. And again,
Hmm.
Lost clearly falls into that category as well. Did you feel like I guess what's your reaction to that, I suppose? Do you feel like that did set the stage for you guys? What was it that kind of brought you guys around to wanting to push that side of what you do?
I don't know. I don't know if it's similar for other bands or other musicians, but I know for us that we do a lot of experimenting and we write a lot of stuff um, for each album. And the the only stuff that you end up hearing are the experiments that we think worked. I won't even say they worked for sure, but we think worked. And mixed into that is obviously the next logical thing is that there's a lot of experiments that don't work, or at least that we don't get to a place where we feel like they're at a spot where we're really happy with it, or that we feel like we've figured out how to get that idea out. So sometimes you have songs that you know the idea that you want to get to, or you know the place that you want to try to push or figure out how to make that work. And sometimes it just takes a while to get across that. Sometimes you never get across it and you never figure out how to do it. And sometimes it's super, super easy. Like sometimes it's like your first time trying something or you have this concept in your head of, oh, I want to try to do this. And it's just boom, 15 minutes later, you're like, I've already built the entire skeleton and great. That was easy. So I don't know. There's different journeys that go along with that. I think with Meteora, looking back, one thing that you can definitely see is a track like Breaking the Habit. That was a very, very different type of song that we hadn't been able to do on Hybrid Theory. Like we hadn't figured out how to make that work, or maybe the timing didn't feel right on that type of a song or a track. But we felt like we had gotten it right with Breaking the Habit. And that song, a big emotive, powerful song, like no distorted guitars, no screaming. But that then opens pathways into like so many things that come after, which we didn't know at the time. But then we look back at it from this point. You look at like what comes later with Minutes to Midnight, what comes later with Living Things, and all these pathways. It just there are little experiments along the way that you're kind of putting tools into your tool case on how you can do things and what you're able to do. So with Lost was a song that we loved, and obviously we all loved it and liked it enough through the entire process to get it to where it finished and almost was on the album. But at the end of it, it just sounded, actually, to me at least, my remembrance of it was it just sounded a little too similar in the space that it was holding. And I liked Numb better. And there's some other songs that I felt like were doing that thing. So it was almost like it wasn't that it was redundant, but it just was that it wasn't needed on the record. And it was very easy at that point for me to kind of say, this is going to have its own space somewhere else where it's not just thrown in, but it has its own special thing. Whether that's like, again, sorry to always go back to Hybrid Theory, but with Hybrid Theory, we had a need for like, oh, Japan wants original B-sides for their album because they want to do a special edition. And we didn't have anything. And then like our local radio station, K-Rock, wanted original tracks for the Christmas album. And like we didn't have anything. We're like, oh crap. We didn't realize that after we came out of the studio and released a record, we were also supposed to have other stuff. Like we kind of just did everything we could on Hybrid Theory. So with Meteora, I just felt like, oh, there's going to be these other spaces where we can use this track. Maybe it's going to be a movie that we don't know of, or a TV usage, or there's going to be a cool space where we can like kind of have this thing have its own moment. And then we just that never came up and we never used it, and then 20 years later, Mike kind of refound it and went to management and said, "Hey, did this ever get released anywhere? Did this song ever get used?" And they're like, "We don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what that song is." So I don't know. All that just to say, like, yeah, different songs end up having their own unique little journeys, and some of them open pathways into other things or new areas. And I feel like I can kind of make sense of that looking back at it. But when you're in the moment, there's no master plan for that. It's just kind of, seeing, opening yourself up and seeing what the universe gives you, seeing what comes into your mind and what's the best song I can write today, or what's the best record we can make this year. Those are the challenges.
I feel like what's interesting as well, you say, giving these songs their moment, it's really fascinating that that moment is now. I don't just mean in terms of, oh, you're getting to do a 20-year reissue, which obviously as fans we all love. I mean the fact that a song like Lost and Now Fighting Myself as well are having huge success, particularly in the States, particularly in the charts. What do you attribute to that? Because I find it fascinating the way that a song 20 years ago that could have been released by a new band today and would have been equally as successful. For some reason, right now, it fits just as well as it could have done 20 years ago. There's something happening now that, I don't know, it feels like it's filling a void, maybe. People are excited to hear that sort of sound again in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I wish I had a great answer. I wish I knew how or why any of that worked, but I don't. But I do know that our fan base, for whatever reason, has always been insanely supportive of everything we've done and everything we've tried. Um, and so I have felt so fortunate, throughout our career to have the type of fan base and the type of fans that we have, the type of people that we have, um, kind of in the Linkin Park community. And I think this has been a project where, for me, when I first kind of listened to that song again, I had forgotten about the song. As soon as I heard it, I was like, "Oh, I remember this," but at the same time, I was getting to listen to it with fresh ears, having not heard it for 20 years and kind of almost not even thought about it for 20 years. So I was also almost like, uh, not caught by surprise is not the exact way to say it, but a little bit of caught by surprise by Chester's voice, and just kind of taking me back to that early place of like, oh yeah, like I love his voice. Like this, he's got an awesome, incredible connection with what he's singing, and there's so much power there. And it was just almost like I was hearing him sing something fresh and new. And I think, or I was hoping that was going to be able to then go to the fans as well, and for them to have that similar experience of, even though it's 20 years old, having something feel like, a person or a singer that you really love, you're getting to hear something new from them.
What I find interesting listening back to the record after all this time again, just in full back to back, is that a song like Breaking the Habit and a song like Nobody's Listening, and even a song like Faint, I don't think would have necessarily arrived if it hadn't been for Reanimation as well. I feel like that
Mm.
project and that moment, being able to twist songs in a slightly different way and I guess open up the audience to that idea as well, that you guys could bring in those new sounds a little bit. How much do you attribute what happened with Reanimation, I suppose, to influencing those kind of songs on the record?
Yeah, I think Reanimation was a great chance for us to kind of show our other interests and show the stuff that's in the music, but push it to the forefront. Um, so with hybrid theory, the hybrid theory, as as funny as that is to say now, was we wanted to take elements of different musical styles that we liked, and we wanted to present them and put them together in one seamless sound, so that it wasn't, we grew up listening in Southern California, listening to hard rock and listening to hip hop and listening to gangster rap and listening to Depeche Mode, all these different sounds and influences, ranging from electric guitars to rapping to synth to whatever, programmed electronic music. So that was the hybrid theory. That was our big, oh, we're gonna do this crazy stuff. How no one's ever done it. Like, that was the big push of what we were doing. And so much so that originally the band was called Hybrid Theory. And when that didn't work out, we named the first album Hybrid Theory, right? So, but in the process of that album, there's aspects of those that are, if you think of it in terms of a mixing board, there's aspects of all those different influences that are turned way up and there's ones that are turned down. And so Reanimation was an opportunity for us to kind of say, like, let's do some of the other stuff that we love and bring those to the forefront and not have these faders or not have these influences so brought to the forefront. Let's mess around with the balance there a little bit and show some of our other sides. And that project was a ton of fun to do and just gave us, I think, even more time and confidence in the studio and time and confidence working with and getting to touch base with a lot of other artists that we loved and kind of respected a ton. So when it came time to do Meteora, there was just this idea of let's keep pushing in different spaces and continue challenging ourselves in that way. And we wanted, like, nobody's listening as a hip hop track. So, like, and Mike had come from such a hip hop background and everything he'd been doing since he was 15 years old or younger. It just made sense for us to try that, to put that there as well.
Yeah, fits very well, and it's the art of making something like that flow together as well, isn't it? That's almost a challenge in itself. Like, yeah, you can have all these influences and you want to bring them together, but like it's the art of making it not sound disjointed in any way when you play through a record. There is a real skill to that.
Yeah, that's like I I think like Mike Shinoda in general gets maybe tired of me talking of it this way, but I always equate so many things in music to food, right? So even in the sense that you talk about your musical taste, I think there's a reason why that word or that connection makes sense. And creatively, when it comes to music, if you're trying to blend all this stuff, you need to there's an artistry to figuring out like the finesse point of doing that and doing that well, similar to cooking or food. You need to have a strong grip of what your different flavors are before you start like just mixing them and mashing them together. You need the people who are great at it are the ones who do all these experiments. They try it out. They do the deep dive and learning everything they can about it, but they also love it. They also just like that's what they want to be doing is figuring out what's a new twist to put on this and how can I do it so that you're not just like overwhelmed or grossed out by what you're eating, quote unquote, what you're taking in, what you're hearing. So there's a lot of, and as you go with that, you learn, oh shoot, if I put this and this together, it pushes this button, and I don't like that, right? I don't want it to give you that feeling. So then I need to know what is my new way to redirect around that to kind of start to learn how to accomplish the goal with what I'm trying to deliver.
Yeah, always a learning process for sure, and it's interesting to see what you guys were able to achieve pushing forward. A few more questions for you. I mean, we've touched on Lost quite a lot. I'd love to mention Fighting Myself as well. Do you have memories of that one actually being put together back in the day, and where did it kind of emerge? What was I guess your kind of reaction finally hearing it again after all this time?
So many of these songs and tracks and demos, when I go back and listen to them at different stages, like you can tell me the title of it all day and I'll have no clue what you're talking about. But as soon as I hear like the first 2 seconds of it, I'll be like, yep, I know exactly what that is. I know I can tell you the chord progressions and when it goes X, Y, and Z. Um, but it's always funny to me because I do lose, and a lot of them probably because they are just working titles that are pulled out of thin air, and we have for each album for Meteora, I'd say I would guess that we probably did something like 50 to 60 songs. And then later albums, sometimes I know that like Minutes to Midnight, we got over 100 different songs. And so there's at a certain point, you're kind of like, yeah, I have no clue what that particular one is. But then when you dig back into them, you start really realizing like, oh, this is the one that we just couldn't figure out kind of like we were talking about earlier. We just couldn't figure out how to get the connection right between this or this, right? Or maybe it never found the right lyrical twist to kind of like land the plane on what it was supposed to be. Or this one had an awesome bridge, but we didn't ever get a chorus to make that work. There's a song, I can't, it was called A6 for a while. I think like fans would know that one for sure. And it's got this one, still one of my favorite like guitar riffs that Brad ever wrote. And it has this awesome build. But then, so we got it from like the first 40 seconds or so of it. It was like, this is the coolest track ever. Like this has so much potential. And then we could just never get it to go anywhere. It was like, so it just became this classic, like, that's a great 40 seconds, but now what? Like we can't, it doesn't lead to anything really compelling as far as a vocal melody, or it doesn't like lend itself to, or at least we couldn't get it across that bridge. So a lot of these demos, when I go back and listen to them, a lot of them for me are, especially the ones that we end up like letting the fans then hear, or that we put on these kind of things. These are songs that I feel like, or that we feel like have had a ton of potential, but they just didn't get to the album level. Some of them on there too, like if you dig into the Meteora 20 package, there's so much content on there that there's other ones that are far earlier along in the demo stage. And some of them, sometimes you're just kind of like, this idea might really come to something if I spend, another X amount of hours just trying to drill into it. And we either kind of just run out of time with it, or you move on to a new thing that's like, this one's moving quicker and has the feel better, that I'm not going to need to pour so much into it just to mine out whatever it is that I think might be in there. But in the process of that, you end up having all of these like kind of seeds of songs that are at different stages. Some of them, like the ones that you're hearing, have vocals and have Chester singing in it, are pretty fleshed out ideas, but aren't just quite at the end of that road where they'd be on the album. And then some of them are even more like at like an instrumental stage, or at an earlier experimentation stage.
Yeah, it's nice to be able to hear, those how it all pieces together. Though it just you can see where things led to make the kind of fuller package of the album we all know and love. Really, Dave, I'm going to leave you with this. It's something that's, I guess, kind of a bigger question, but when you have been looking back now on that time in particular, is there anything you can point to in the recording process or the writing or whatever it is with this particular record that then ended up carrying through? Is there any lessons that we'll learn with Meteora that then fed into the future of Linkin Park in a kind of bigger way?
Maybe not so much with the album as far as what I'm thinking right now, but I know for certain that our process in our touring and in our live presentation of that album really, I think, carried through into everything we're doing. And it was really fun for me actually to see that process move from the beginning of the touring cycle to the end. You can look at the DVDs that are the DVDs of live shows and live footage that are in the Meteora 20 set. There's one that's early on, kind of a smaller venue. There's one, a live concert that's kind of mid album cycle, and there's one like a stadium show with Metallica that's at the end of the cycle. So hopefully I saw progression of how we were trying to present our live show and make that really keep up with how much success the albums were having. We wanted to continue to challenge ourselves to be a better and better live band, and have that keep up with, almost in a weird way, what we felt like the fans were hoping or expecting for in a live show. And I think that you can see the progression that happened over those 2 years. And I think it's really set us on a good trajectory moving forward to really try to put a ton of time, effort, energy, all the blood, sweat, and tears into the live show, and make that like an emphasis for what we're doing and what we wanted to do.